So the title is, do older workers squeeze out younger workers? So another way of saying it is the lump of labor theory true? And why would we look at this? Because we American economists generally think it's just hogwash, but working longer is really the key to a secure retirement. And I think that's really the theme of almost everybody in this room. These data pertain to the United States, and they show the percent of working households that will not be able to maintain their standard of living in retirement. But across the world, people are living longer and retiring at young ages, and the arithmetic simply doesn't work out. The most potent lever that people have is to stay in the labor force. You would have thought that in the United States that there wasn't much resistance for keeping older workers in the labor force. But in the wake of the Great Recession, there's been a newspaper story after newspaper story that says, boy, if those old guys stay working, the younger people won't have any job slots. So it seemed like it was worth taking another look. And then from April's perspective in China, there is some interest afloat about increasing the retirement ages for both men and women, which are extremely young. But if you talk to Chinese officials, they are very concerned about the lump of labor theory, that there won't be any jobs for younger people. As I said, American economists have generally said this theory doesn't hold water. We have a dynamic economy. Basically, the supply of labor in the long run determines the employment levels. When you look at academic studies, there's no evidence from the immigration studies that immigrants do harms to natives. In the two pieces of work that have been done for the US and China, Gruber and Milligan in the David Wise's and John Gruber's nice volume on looking precisely at this issue shows no effect. And the Chinese study that we looked at showed no effect in China. But essentially the beat goes on, and so we decided to try to do a more in-depth. Gruber and Milligan were sort of constrained because they were doing the same exercise for many countries, so they looked at one dimension. We thought we looked at all dimensions of the problem, and we thought that the variation across states and across Chinese provinces would offer a promising avenue of exploration. So given that, April will tell you what we actually did.
Thanks, Alicia, for setting the stage up. So for our US analysis, the data comes from the current population survey 1977 to 2011 waves. And we divided our sample into 3 groups to be consistent with the literature. So our young group is individuals aged 20 to 24, and the prime aged group is 25 to 54, and our older worker group is 55 to 64. And as Alicia mentioned, there is a substantial spatial variation in terms of labor supply across the state and over time. For instance, as you can see from this graph, the employment rate for older workers in 2011 is only 44% in Louisiana, but it is 80% in North Dakota. And the changes in the employment of older workers also vary close over time by state. We see over time from 1977 to 2011, the employment rate of older workers increased by 15 percentage points in Connecticut, but it declined by 6 percentage points in Louisiana. So we think those variations provide us a very promising avenue to examine, to measure the impact of older workers' labor force participation on the younger ones. And our baseline equation relates outcome for younger workers to employment of older workers. So our unit of analysis is a state year, and our baseline equation estimates a state fixed effect equation. So our outcome variables is the labor market measures of interest, include the young's unemployment rate, employment rate, hours worked, and their hourly wage rate, and the total earnings. And our coefficient of interest is this older workers' employment rate at a state at a year. And we also controlled in our X factors a range of variables, capture the socioeconomic and the demographic characteristics by state, and the variables to measure the labor market nature and the structure of employment by state. We also include this indicator for the Great Recession, try to capture the impact of the economic downturn on the labor market. So if the crowding out were occurring, then we would see the increase in older workers' employment will increase younger workers' unemployment. But our baseline equation shows that the coefficient is negative and insignificant. Instead, we found 1% increase in older workers' employment is associated with 0.007 percentage point increase in the employment of younger workers, and which is statistically insignificant. We also found the positive impact on hours worked, but it's insignificant. Therefore, our baseline equation shows older workers do not harm younger workers. What about older workers' impact on prime age workers? We repeat our analysis on the prime aged group, and we found the employment of older workers is associated with a negative increase in the unemployment of the young and the positive increase in the hour worked, though it's not statistically significant. And the only thing significant is this employment rate. Again, it's a 1 percentage point increase is related to a 0.04 percentage point increase in the prime ages employment rate. So there's, again, no evidence of crowding out. And to counter for the secular trend of women's labor force participation, we repeat our analysis by gender. And we found for both males and females, there's no evidence of crowding out. If there's anything, we see the increase in the employment of older workers is associated with the increase in younger males' hours worked. That is the only thing we find significant, but it's positive. And if the crowding out of the younger worker by old do exist, we might see younger workers suffered from the reduced wage rate by the increased labor force participation by the elderly. Then we measured two other outcomes. One is the hourly wage rate, another is your total earnings. And we found, again, if there's anything, there are some positive results. Also, the potential of older workers to crowding out the younger workers depends on the degree to which they are substitutes. Economic theory suggests the more similar the groups are with respect to the skills, the more likely they to be the substitute. So in this way, we further divided our data. We asked, do the results differ by the level of education? And we do not find any evidence that the relationship between older workers and the younger groups' employment rate differed by the educational attainment. The fundamental flaw of the lump of labor theory rely on because it's ignoring this long-term labor market adjustment. But in the short run, things might be different. So we ask, did things change in the Great Recession? Because it's a time that the economic growth is very slow and there's a very, very big unemployment rate. So we estimate the full interaction models. We let the recession dummies to interact with our coefficient of interest and also all the variables in our X vectors. And our result shows the relationship did not change in the Great Recession. Even in the situation of Great Recession, we do not find older workers harm younger workers. So far, we cut our data by age, by gender, by education, by time period. But even when controlling for various determinants of labor market measures, the approach described above is difficult to be interpreted as a causal. Because if there is some unobservable factors simultaneously impact both employment of older and younger workers, then endogeneity concern can arise. And in this way, to account for the endogeneity, and in this way, our OLS estimate will be biased towards a positive value. To counter for this concern, we employed the instrument variable approach. So the goal is to look for the instrument, which will have to be impact the older workers' employment rate, but not directly impact the employment rate of other age group. What we found here, we used its state, year, age-specific mortality rate. Despite what we just had a discussion of the mortality rate, what I'm going to show you in our first stage using the cross-state elderly mortality rate, we do find that there is a strong significant impact of the elderly Owen group mortality rate on its own employment rate, which is consistent with what literature suggests the health impact on the employment. But also literature offers very little support. One group's mortality rate will impact the other group's employment rate. Luckily, the recent work by the Ann Hoff Stevens and his co-authors also showed there are some independency between one group's own mortality rate and other group's employment rate. So we're using this as our instrument variable and estimate a two-stage least square model. In the first stage, we measure the impact of elderly male elderly mortality rates on the impact of older workers' employment rate. In the second stage, rather than directly measuring the older workers' employment rate, we use a predicted value from the first stage. And our first stage result, as I just mentioned, it's significant, have expected signs, and pass the F-test of the 10. And in our second stage, we did not really find consistent evidence about any crowding out. So we repeat our instrument approach to our data cut by gender, by age, by education attainment. And again, there's no consistent evidence to showing any crowding out between the older worker and the younger ones. So because the lump of labor theory drives the retirement policy in China, so we repeat our analysis using available Chinese data. The Chinese data comes from Chinese Census Bureau, the population survey. The available data to us is 1990, 2000, and 2005. In the same spirit as what we did for the US analysis, we repeat our analysis using the province level variations. So there are 31 provincial level deviations in China. We again divided our sample into 3 age groups, but our age definition is slightly different from our US analysis. It's mainly due to the very low statutory retirement age in China. So here, our younger workers are those 20 to 24. Primary age, the male is 25 to 49, and the female is 25 to 44. And for our older worker group, male is 50 to 64, and the female is 45 to 59, because the statutory retirement age for female is at 50. So if we set this higher, the employment rate is really low. And again, we see there's a substantial variation in labor market behaviors across province. For instance, we see in 2005, in Jiangsu province, 63% of older men in the labor force, but in the neighboring Jiangxi province, it's only 52%. And the young unemployment rate also varies substantially. It is lower as 6% in Anhui province, but in the neighboring Henan province, it's higher as 15%. So we again make use of this substantial variation across province. And our baseline equation, province fixed effect model, again, it's very consistent with what we estimate in the US. We found older worker employment in China does not impact the young employment or unemployment rate. We again apply the same analysis to the primary age as identical to our US analysis, and we found if there is anything, we find some positive effect rather than crowding out. We also ask, is the result differ by gender? We also find the results are very consistent and there is no differential impact by gender. So for our China analysis, we also take the same approach as the US analysis. We want to control for the endogeneity and use an instrument variable approach. But the state year age-specific mortality rate is not available to us in our Chinese data, so we have to take a different approach. In the future, next round, when we revise this paper, I would want to test both different instrument variable on both sides to see whether it's consistent. So for this part, what we use is we're using the fraction of older workers approaching to the statutory retirement age among the older worker group. So the rationale there is, if this fraction is big, the employment rate for this group will be lower, but there should be no impact on the younger group. And we're using this instrument variable repeated analysis by group, by age, by education, and we did not find any evidence for any crowding out. Because you might already notice, not like our US analysis, we have 35 waves, 51 states each year. For China analysis, we only have 3 waves of data, 31 data point per wave. So what we showed you insignificant might suffer from the small sample size concerns. For the robustness check, we use, rather than province level data, we use a prefecture level, which we have 350 prefectures in China. And we also further cut our data by education level. And our instrument variable estimation shows no matter how we cut the data, after we increase our sample size, there's still no evidence of any crowding out. So in the conclusion, as Alicia mentioned at the beginning, despite this excellent work by Group and Weiss and Group and Milligan here, the resist of the delayed retirement of the elderly continues, and this noise is very loud during the Great Recession. So we think it's a time to conduct this analysis. And our analysis shows there's no evidence that increase the employment of older persons, reduce the job opportunity of younger persons in the US or China. And the pattern are consistent for both men and women, for group with different level education, for the different time period. And also I did not show you, but we went through numerous other specifications to check the robustness of our test. So convincing the policymakers and the employer that the lump of labor theories do not hold, it's very important, given the state of US retirement income system and the need for people to work longer. Also given the increased burdens of retirees in China. At the end of this journey, we would hope to say we beat this horse. This horse has been beaten to death. And we believe that the public discourse will be improved dramatically by putting the lump of labor theory to rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm trying. There we go. Okay, there are many things to like about this paper. One of the things that I particularly liked was I got a little bit of history about the lump of labor theory from reading the paper. So the paper claims the lump of labor theory can be traced to Henry Mayhew's 1851 London Labor and the London Poor. Mayhew argued that cutting the number of hours employees worked would reduce unemployment. And then they note that the first rebuttal of the lump of labor theory started with David Schloss in 1891. So we've had 120 years of economics consistently beating up on the lump of labor theory relatively unsuccessfully. What is the theory exactly? So here's my, I was wondering if David and Kevin would laugh at this slide. I stole it back. You stole it from me. No, this is my slide initially. 4.5 years ago, I discussed David and John's book at the ASSA meetings. And so I get to reuse a slide from that. What is the lump of labor theory? So here, instead of having a lump of labor, we have a box of labor. And these are the guys who are lucky enough to have jobs. And we've got a line of unemployed younger workers here. And the lump of labor theory posits that in order for these guys to get a job, we got to induce some of the guys that are already there to leave the labor force and retire. So after 120 years of economists beating up on this, I kind of feel like this theory comes out of a Monty Python movie. I'm not dead yet. So let's see if we can kill the theory once and for all. The first thing I did, and I think you guys should put some of this in the paper, was to plot some of the data on labor force participation rates over time. Well, these are at a point in time. The relationship between the labor force participation rates for the older population, so 55 to 64 in the US, versus the young and the prime-age workers. So on the x-axis in these graphs, we have the labor force participation rate of the older workers, and then the red boxes are the young workers, and the gray boxes are the prime-age workers. So the graph on the left-hand side shows the relationships in 1977. The graph on the right-hand side shows the relationships in 2001. So a couple of things to notice about these charts. Number one, you can see the variation in the data. There's a lot of variation in the data. And it certainly appears like there is a positive relationship in these graphs. That is, that when labor force participation rate is higher for older workers, labor force participation rate is also higher for younger workers. Now, you might be worried that there's some unobservable characteristic in a certain state that leads to higher labor force participation across the board for everyone. So we could take a difference. So let's just take a long difference between 1977 and 2001. And now on this slide, I've got on the x-axis the change in the labor force participation rate of the older population, and the change in the labor force participation rate of the younger population in the two different groups. Once again, substantial variation in changes over time and still a positive relationship. So this is the type of variation that they're exploiting in their empirical analysis, and for me it was useful to just see it and appreciate it in a graphical form. So April showed you only a small fraction of the empirical equations they estimate in the paper. So they are trying hard to nail the coffin into this theory by slicing and dicing the data in many different ways. So there's the within-state variation in the change in labor force participation rates over time. They look at everyone all together. They break it down by gender and by education. They try using 3-year lagged employment rates of the older population to get around the fact that there might be some contemporaneous economic shocks affecting different groups at the same time. They pool the data to get around some potential issues with small sample sizes when they break things down into smaller cells. They use generalized least squares. They instrument for labor force participation of the old with the mortality of the old, and David Wise and Kevin did a great job providing the rationalization for why that might actually be a good instrument. I've never seen such a good setup for an instrument at a conference like this. They look at whether there's a differential impact in the recession. They turn to China. They're looking at cross-sectional variation in labor force participation rates by region, and then they have an instrumental variable strategy there as well. They've got lots of regression estimates. So I took just the regression estimates for the US, not wanting to mix the US and China together. And I counted 38 different regression specifications. I may have gotten them wrong. It was late on the plane yesterday. So here's my attempt to graphically represent their estimates. So if you look at the impact of employment of the old on employment outcomes of the young and the prime-aged workers, black means the effect is positive and significant. So the lump of labor theory says it should be negative and significant. So the black is it's going in the wrong direction and it's significant. The gray is it's going in the wrong direction and it's insignificant. The pink is it's going in the right direction and it's insignificant. And the red, which you don't see here for the employment estimates, is it's going in the right direction for the lump of labor theory, and it's significant. So there are no significant estimates of the 38 estimates, and most of them are significant in the wrong direction, and a third of them are insignificant in one of the two directions. Then if you look at the effect on unemployment, now for unemployment, the prediction is that if the employment of older is higher, the unemployment rate of the younger should be higher. So the signs you're looking at are going in the opposite direction. But once again, everything's insignificant. Very few things are significant. Hours, wages, and they have 6 specifications where they're looking at annual earnings. I mean, no matter the number of significant estimates they get, you would get purely by chance. Slicing and dicing data many different ways. They find no evidence that would support the lump of labor theory. So take this in conjunction, since I discussed Kevin and John's book, I have this slide handy too, all of the evidence they take to marshal against the lump of labor theory, and they're using very different sources of data, very different identification strategies. They're looking at international comparisons, they're using within-country natural experiments, they're using cross-country natural experiments, all sorts of things. You add it all together, and how could anyone come away from this and believe in the lump of labor theory? I don't know, but I fully expect that the next recession we have, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times will be publishing the same stories that you cited earlier. Okay, so what kind of comments do I have to offer on the paper in terms of things that maybe you could do differently? I think the first is there's a little bit of mismatch between the way the data is used in China and the way the data is used in the US. The data are a little bit different, but for example, with the Chinese data, they're really forced to use cross-sectional variation. I think it would be nice for the US data to actually start out and use all the variation, then put in state fixed effects, then put in time fixed effects separately, then put them both in, and see what the results look like depending on which variation you're using to pin down the results in the data. Next, kind of along the lines of the Gerber-Wise book, I was wondering if there were any natural experiments in the US that you could exploit. And I didn't think very long and hard about this, but two ideas came to mind. One is in my now very dated work with John Gruber on health insurance and retirement outcomes. We exploited cross-state variation in the availability of continuation coverage in the 1970s and 80s. And there was a relationship with employment outcomes. So could you use that as an instrument for employment for older workers? Or are there changes in defined benefit pension coverage? I don't know if that's as kind of cleanly exogenous, but I don't know. Maybe there are some natural experiments that would be worth exploiting as well. Next comment is, I guess the one thing that's most lacking from the paper is some sort of a framework for thinking about how to evaluate the empirical results in the paper. So, there's some notion that there's, in the background, there's a theory of labor demand that has some sort of production function that has demand for older workers and younger workers in there, but it's never very explicit. And this ties into the next comment, which is, what's the right formulation of the boxed economy hypothesis? So what kind of variables would you want to look at? How would you parameterize the employment of the old? And what's the right dependent variable to look at? So to tie these last two comments together, let me just show you a couple of other slides that have a graphic representation of what I'm trying to get at. So on the top, we've got a labor market. It may not look like a labor market to you, but it's a labor market. We've got two groups of workers. We've got the old in gray and darker gray, and we've got the young in pinkish orange and darker pinkish orange. And the lighter colors are guys who are in the economy, but they're not working. And the darker colors are the guys who are in the economy and they are working. Okay, so on the very top, the economy is evenly divided between the young and the old. The labor force is evenly divided between the young and the old. The labor force, I've just put some numbers on there, 40 people in both cases. The population is 100 in both cases. And the labor force participation rate is 40% for both cases. Okay, so now go down to the rectangle on the bottom. Now suppose we take 10 workers from the old and move their jobs to the young. Okay, so we shift the jobs, we increase the size of the gray, the people who exist but are not working, and we transfer their jobs to the young. So we've increased the red box on the bottom. Okay, so if we calculate the change in the labor force, the number of people working, we have 10 fewer older people working and 10 more younger people working. Those numbers are the same, and if we divide them, we get 1. The ratio of the change of the old relative to the change of the young is 1. On the bottom, we have a 10%, this is actually not 10%. Like I said, it was a long plane ride. I was not thinking clearly. 10% is not the right number. no, actually 10% relative to the size of the population. That is the right number. That's not the change in the labor force participation rate, though. But either way, the change in the labor force participation rate is going to be the same for both groups, and if I divide them, I'm going to get a -1. Okay, so if this is the formulation of the economy, I'm going to get -1s if I estimate the model, and I'm going to -1 if I use the number of people employed or if I use the labor force participation rate. Okay, now let's suppose the economy looks a little bit different. And now we have an economy where we have fewer old people and we've got more young people, okay? So the gray area is smaller and the red area is bigger. And now, if I go from the top to the bottom and I transfer 10 jobs from the old to the young, now the change in the labor force, if I'm using employment as the metric, it's going to be -1 if I take the ratio of the young to the old, estimating elasticity. But if I look at the labor force participation rate, because the size of the labor force is not the same for the old and the young, or the size of the population is not the same for the old and the young, the change in the labor force participation rate is now different for these two groups, and the elasticity I'm going to get is -0.75. So, I'm someone who likes to think not just about signs and significance, but to also think about magnitudes, and how to interpret the magnitude depends on what your, what data you're using and what your underlying kind of model is of labor demand and production in the economy. So it would be great to have some more on that in the paper. But nice paper, and hopefully this will have been the final nail in the coffin of the labor demand theory, and I will not be asked to discuss another paper on the same topic in 3 or 4 years. But if I do, I'm ready.
You are ready. Thank you very much. Questions? Yes, Peter.
So I am completely ignorant of this field of research. So this is just a question that might reflect that ignorance. But is employment treated as a binary category in each case, or is it continuous? I mean, is there contemplation of underemployment, the kinds of employment for the younger workers? Because you could imagine a box theory of a view of the world, a box economy view of the world, where there's crowding out not of employment as a binary category, but the different kinds of employment occurs with higher levels of retirement. And I don't know if people have looked at that already, or if your data on wages and hours is reflecting that. If you could just talk about that a little bit more.
It's binary.
But it's like what Alicia's, it's like what your question asked. Yes, the hours of work sort of reflect some of this if you only worked a few hours. But it's directly taken from the CPS questions, like do you include working the last month, last year? And for our analysis, because it's a state year average, so it's a fraction of people in the labor force. But at the individual level, it's taken as a binary. Yeah.
Laura? Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Really
Hignall Benton with Mercer's Workforce Sciences Institute. This is a very impressive and convincing paper. And I think if we take the boxed economy view at a macro level, the coffin deserves to be there. But April, you kind of made an equivalence between convincing policymakers and convincing employers. And there, I think there's a more fuzzy ground, and there may be reasons that this view remains with employers, even if at the macro level it's not confirmed by the evidence. And I spend my life with our team working with large client organizations, analyzing the internal labor market dynamics of their workforce. So modeling predictors of promotion, retention, pay increase, and the like to help them build strategies. In the last 5 years, we've been seeing patterns among the larger, more mature organizations that we never used to see before. And that is a very strong decline in the velocity of talent movement through organizations. particularly in the US and in Europe, where growth opportunities are limited, particularly among organizations that tend to build their workforce from within. They pursue build strategies. We are seeing this phenomenon of delayed retirement, lack of growth, velocity declining, career choke points emerging at low points in the organization where we never would have seen them before. And when we do the modeling of turnover, we're finding it is younger, up and coming, higher performing, high potential talent that has a much larger probability of going out the door. And it's in large measure because they are feeling blocked within the organization. So I think the kind of theory that's saying there's some displacement going on here for an employer who's thinking about managing their workforce effectively, keeping dynamism in their internal labor market, is not an abstraction to think we got rid of our defined benefit plan. We got rid of the only thing that actually provided an incentive for people to retire once eligible. Now, if they don't have that incentive, they're staying on. And in the build environment with low growth, there is a transition taking place. And I just wanted to put that on the table as to why this theory may not die as quickly as it should if you're looking at the macro level. It's kind of a levels issue that I think is important.
Can I just respond to that? Because we had someone come in to talk to us with a very large company that has an R&D arm that still has a defined benefit plan. And the board of this company is ridiculing the head of HR, saying, don't you read the Wall Street Journal? Don't you know no one has these anymore? And this guy is actually really smart. It's what they need for their company because they need to get people out. So there are, of course, stories at the individual level, but it seems like if you're going to make policy on the basis of this stuff, it's got to hold up across.
Yeah, I mean, it may be the same organization.
I think it
I
might
don't know,
be.
but very recently we've been working
Did you get
with,
baby
with
powder
a
and
very large, very large global organization where the board is pushing for this based on what others have done. And when we analyze our internal labor market dynamics, we say that DB plan is the core of what makes this work. If they were like other companies we worked with, got rid of the DB plan, you'd see the stall out, you'd see the displacement that I'm talking about. So no, policy at a government level, no, but for individual companies, when you're trying to build a talent strategy, which may determine if your business is successful or not, this is a very real concern that they need to act on.
Interesting. Joanna and then Hank.
Do you have a soundbite that one could give to a reporter when asked this question?
Yeah, an older person working a year longer is not going to stop a young person from getting a job.
Why not?
Because we have a dynamic economy. People are not only workers, they're consumers. And so everything grows the more people work. I don't know if that works. No, it doesn't work. We'll make them read this whole long, boring paper.
I don't really believe in the lump of labor theory at all. I didn't before your paper, and I don't now, with respect to the long run. I'm unpersuaded, in light of the question that Peter asked, in light of the observation that was just made, that there aren't short-term issues of exactly the kind that the lump of labor theory suggests are enduring incorrectly. But it seems to me, I mean, the example I will give is not one that you used, and it's an anecdote, but one heard lots of stories about Indian college graduates driving cabs. Now, on your standard, they were employed, no problem.
That's Peter.
But as far as clogging the lines of progress, that was an example where there was a gross mismatch between educational levels and the nature of job opportunities. So it's not really apposite, but I think it's illustrative of the kind of short-term problem that I can't dismiss based on your evidence.
So, Henry, we were worried about the possibility that things could be different in the Great Recession. We didn't adjust for job quality. It was a binary thing.
That's important.
But, yeah.
But we look at the wage, the average wage by education group.
Yeah.
Wage. We look at your hourly wage and your annual income. So I believe these two measures should capture some of what you described. If
And
all the
during the
college graduates are driving the cab during the Great Recession, we should see the decline in wage at this time period. Because I don't believe they earn the same wage rate as they become a white-collar person versus a cab driver. But we do not find any evidence, not only in general economic conditions, also by we divided by education, by time period, in these other measures.
I guess I have the, well, I'm sensitive to this question. Everybody, if you ever get a journalist calling you, they ask you, where will the jobs come from? A colleague of mine who got this, Alan Kruger, who actually recently asked me where the jobs are going to come from. He was required by the president to do this. He actually wrote a paper about this. Why are there more jobs in China than there are in India? There are more people in China than there are in India.
Exactly.
Why are there more jobs in the U.S. than there are in Canada? There are more people in the U.S. than Canada. And a graph between employment and population is like a perfect straight line deal. So yes, it's very hard to claim that, I don't understand, in fact, I think the lump of labor issue really is more, goes to what Henry was saying, which is the notion of short-term unemployment, where there's a concern about aggregate demand. But my questions are different from that, other than the employment issue, which is, this is a clever paper. I mean, it's an interesting paper for me, but what you're doing is something that, as Brigitte pointed out, is the relationship between two things that are really determined by the same factors. So there's the sense in which you can claim there's a causal relationship between one and the other. That it's hard to think exactly what that would mean in this context. The one thing that I thought was kind of an interesting attempt for you to think about this was when you used the mortality rate as an instrument. Now, actually, despite what you said, if you look in the Milligan and Wise paper, they actually find the reverse. There's a graph here, I just pulled it out, in their paper, figure 3.1, which 3-1, which shows there's no relationship across countries between decreases in mortality and increases in employment. So actually, the evidence from the Milligan and Wise paper is that it's not a good instrument. Now that just goes on, so I'm a little bit puzzled about how you, I think it would be better if you were going to use it as an instrument to try to explain why that would fit into a structural model. But I'm also a little concerned because when I looked at table 7, I noticed the first stage coefficient, which I guess is on the old people's, if I may call them geezers, because I am one, the geezer mortality. It seems to me the first stage equation should be the same for both the prime age people and the young people, and yet those coefficients aren't the same. So I don't know whether you have an explanation for why that is, but it looked to me like the first stage equation is the same for both of the second stage results. So that's a technical question, but maybe you need to go back to the drawing board there or something.
It's going to be Gary, Steve, and Josh. Did you want to respond to that now?
Sure. Can I respond quickly before I forget? Yeah. So I first appreciate the comments. I think those comments are very helpful. And in terms of mortality rate, when I was sitting in the audience listening to Weiss and Milligan's paper, I sort of have same feeling with you, but I would hope I read this paper early on, so I probably can respond better. But I think we use different variations. So they use cross-country. And what's the time period? It's 70 to 2000, is that? And we use this cross-state variations in the mortality rate and the employment. And we do find the strong correlations in our estimation. So I cannot at now answer why we have different we have different result. I think we probably need to talk secretly, and some will maybe in recession. But I would like to explore more about that, why use cross countries variation did not tell. And I also think they are using the changes over time. We look at cross-sectional, like at each point, whether the higher mortality rate is related to the higher employment rate. So I believe it's a difference in the data and the variation we are using. But I think we needed to figure out, is that the valid instrument? This is a good question and a good comment. And in terms of table 7, so why there is a difference between the primary age and the younger people's first stage, it's due to the sample size, because then we all use by state, by year. But for some of the state, and for some of the state, for the younger age group, the sample size become extremely small, or the estimate become extremely weird because we only have a few people by the certain category in this age bracket 20 to 24. So we actually do not have equal sample size. This might lead to the slight difference, but I would like to look more into that to make sure there's no technical mistake or something. But I appreciate you pointed this out.
I wonder whether there's a different way to frame the question. You seem to treat the lump of labor theory as what must be falsified, and that's going to get you a lot of sympathy in the economics profession in the United States, 95% of whose members would reject that out of hand, and for, I think, excellent reasons. But you might, for your readers to therefore infer that there's never a point in any business cycle in which there's a trade-off between the desire of older workers to remain in the labor force longer and the employment fortunes of younger people, strikes me as very strong and is not justified by my reading of this paper. I think there are modern theories of labor market turnover that do emphasize what role turnover plays in different phases of business cycles. If you think that there is an insufficiency of aggregate demand for everyone to be employed, it is natural to ask, well, who are the people who are employed? And in the phase of the business cycle where it's not a high layoff rate, but instead a lack of employment openings, employment opportunities, you would certainly think, from everything that we know about the determinants of turnover, that if older people in that environment want to stay in their jobs longer, there is going to be a price for people who are younger. There are just fewer vacancies for them to fill. This is not the lumpy theory. This is a theory that got 3 people Nobel Prizes a couple of years ago, and I don't think you can just treat it that way. You have to think, well, under what conditions is there a trade-off? And I don't think that I saw persuasive statistical evidence that rejects the fact that there is some adverse impact on younger people of the fact that quit rates for people past the age of 50, 55 are extraordinarily low, which is linked to the way they are staying in the workforce longer.
Let's go to Steve and then Josh.
I think it's a comment, it's not a question.
I guess the soundbite, because I'm interested in the soundbite too,
Yeah.
is that if more older workers are working, it makes the pie bigger, or the box is bigger.
Yeah.
And if they stop working, they're consuming less. And that's the soundbite, I'm guessing. And then I'm putting it together with what Haig was saying. I'm curious, Haig, the big global companies that you're talking about, are they not growing? And is that a cause for clogging the promotional channels rather than substituting labor at different ages?
It's very, I think it's kind of, I hate to say this, but it's kind of. I'm sorry, we can't hear. I'm sorry. So I'm usually asked these questions because I study age discrimination, and it just kind of makes me bristle when you say, well, we have to get rid of these older workers as if they're not productive. And in order for companies to actually be having a problem keeping the older workers and not moving the younger workers along, it's got to be that you've got laissez contracts, that you have, it's very difficult to fire people. And, you know, these things may be true, but it's not just about older workers. It's like, you are unable to fire unproductive workers or people who are less productive. And yes, there are, like, you know, training things, but that should just be, you know, the middle-aged people are getting trained and so on. So, I mean, even within a company, I have a very hard time with this idea that older workers not retiring is always going to be a bad thing.
Well, Josh has been waiting, if Haig's going to respond directly to that, so you want to, and we will come right back. Yes, and you can hold people up, yeah.
No, I totally accept what you're saying, and we do a lot of this work in support of diversity strategies and older workers as protected group. I was simply commenting on the observation of why this theory might remain in effect, that in build organizations that are not growing and that rely on a tournament structure or a backloaded pay structure, there are built-in incentives for transition in the workforce at certain points in time. When the companies stop growing and their only growth is in emerging markets, the ones I'm talking about are really stalling out in their growth, they have this problem that whether they like it or not, they're losing up-and-coming talent. I don't necessarily want to call that younger talent, but people at more junior levels who are in the workforce less. And those are the ones going out the door with higher probability. So if you're managing that company, this is a concern, right? You have to figure out what can we do, how can we structure our contracts so we still have some ability to shape the workforce, which is increasingly the most important asset of these companies. If you can't shape when people come in and when people leave through your policies, and you leave it completely to the vicissitudes of the stock market, as some pension plans do, you're creating and accepting a form of risk that may be as high as the risks associated with DB plans. And I'm certainly not talking about one size fits all. I'm just saying it has been really interesting to us to see a good number of companies who abandoned their DB plans without thinking of the likely workforce consequences, now facing a challenge in how they're going to manage the workforce. That's all I was trying to make there.
Thank you. Josh, and then Kevin's going to get the last question.
I guess I want to bring it back to the empirics, because after all, it's an empirical paper, and so we can answer this question empirically. I guess I was trying to think through what I was trying to do this sort of, Josh Angrist kind of thinking, well, what would be the ideal experiment here? And I thought, well, okay, maybe the ideal experiment would be that you have some states that might mandate that you have to, mandate early retirement or something, or some countries. So let's just think about an ideal setting where you could do this. Okay, yeah. But and others not. But then that's of course if they mandate they have to keep employing them. There's this question about what the payroll is and what's the total amount of money going into people's pockets. So maybe you'd also want to have some within these that had the mandated that the firms had to keep total payroll constant. I guess it's just there's a very specific story of why it doesn't work that I think why the lump of labor theory is a fallacy that you sort of are forwarding, which is that there's money in people's pockets and they spend it and they consume it, and I'd like to see something that sort of moved a little more away from the problems that Orly was talking about. That there's some states where the old work more and the young work more, and the old are richer and the old are healthier and their mortality rates are lower. So I guess maybe just some discussion of the ideal, in the absence of something else, maybe a discussion of the ideal experiment and how this is similar to or different from that ideal experiment would be my suggestion for the paper.
That's a good idea. Kevin.
Getting my exercise.
So long.
Thanks. I'll be brief. So relative to the paper I wrote with Gruber on this, we looked at the national level, just looking at some trends. So this is a nice innovation to look at the subnational level. I mean, what I recall from writing that paper is we just couldn't kill the positive relationship that was shown in the graphs that Brigitte showed, between employment in different groups in different times. You want to be careful about the causal inferences you're making for these things, but we thought about that as just the overwhelmingly big thing that's affecting youth unemployment is labor demand shocks going on, rather than these substitutions as a big picture, the biggest thing that's hitting them. As trying to explain trends in youth unemployment, it seems like that's the first place to go, rather than these demographic theory. So that's what we took away from that, not to say there aren't these other substitution things, but as the first explanation for why there's youth unemployment that we should go to when approached by the media or something. It might be, there's labor demand trends going on. Last point is mention about maybe putting some more structure on the labor demand side. I know that in the ISS book we did on this, the UK team at one point in the project was trying to implement a more structural model based off some old David Card, Tamala Muir paper that had like a CES production function with different groups. And I don't know if that made it into the final version of their paper, but you might have a look in that volume at the UK team to see exactly what they did.
Great, thank you very much.